Thank you, Rochelle, Provost Lee. Todd, thank you for that, and President Ryken for having me. And of course, the whole Kvamme family for making this whole show possible, really. I've spent almost all of my life in this photograph. That little part of post-Christendom we call Sydney, Australia. I was raised by this beach, Balmoral. I went to school at Mossman High, just up the road. And as a 16-year-old, having never been inside a church, I was first introduced to the Christian faith at a friend's home just down the road. And apart from 6 or 7 years wandering as a musician, I've also spent all of my ministry and academic career in this photo. I've co-founded the Centre for Public Christianity with a bunch of scholar communicators who wanted to make a splash for Jesus Christ in a clearly post-Christian culture in Sydney. I taught at Macquarie University in the Ancient History Department and taught Jesus and the Gospels at Sydney University. And for a decade or more was a pastor of a little but thriving church over in the North Shore of Sydney. All that to say, well, I've lived a sheltered life, obviously, living in one photo my whole life. But really, all that to say that I have very happily exchanged this view for this view. The view from my seat in my office as I sit in the Jean Kvamme chair. We felt compelled to come to America, to play a small part through research and writing and teaching and public media in helping an emerging post-Christian America hear the gospel. And I really hope that I can bridge biblical studies, church history, and public Christianity. And for this enormous privilege, I want to say a huge thank you to the Kvamme family, and especially to Floyd. I never met Jean, of course, but everything I've heard about her made me wish that I'd met her, and also make me very proud that Jean Kvamme is in my job title. And I really pray that Jean's love of humans and of the scripture will undergird everything I do. Tonight, I want to wind back and explore the church's mission to a pre-Christian Roman world. And I want us to puzzle through together whether there's anything to learn for us in our setting, in our rapidly secularizing, almost post-Christian America. The expansion of Christianity in the first 3 centuries is, on anyone's reckoning, remarkable. Here's a table that I expect you all to memorize by evening's end. Not at all. It summarizes 8 scholarly efforts to calculate the number of Christians in the Roman world by the time Emperor Constantine declared himself a Christian in the year 312. It's a huge debate amongst scholars. The highest estimate comes from Rodney Stark, a sociologist of religion, and he calculates 10% of the 60 million people of the Roman Empire was Christian by around the year 300. That's 6 million people. The lowest estimate comes from Bart Ehrman of the University of North Carolina. He often plays the role of party pooper in Christian history circles. And he thinks the number was much lower. He thinks it was about 2.5 million Christians by the year 300, or just 4%. But as I read all the scholarship on the expansion of Christianity, I've got this little method where we just average all of them. And if you average all of them, we can say that by the dawn of the 4th century, something like 4.4 million people were Christians in the empire. That's 7.3% of the Roman world. And I just submit, that is remarkable. Robin Lane Fox, the great Oxford classicist, who is no friend of the Christian faith, remarked, "No other cult in the empire grew at anything like the same speed as Christianity." From a few hundred Christians to a few million in just about 10 generations is extraordinary and required a growth rate of 30% per decade, per decade, per decade. Just soak that up, 30%. Imagine if instead of dropping 15%, the number of Christians in America over the last 10 years had grown by 30%. It would be front page news. We'd all be saying revival has broken out. Imagine 30% per decade, per decade, per decade. So, how did the early Christians do it? And how did they do it without any power or armies or legislation or even much money in those first 300 or 400 years? Now, I have been studying precisely this question for most of my academic career, and sometimes I feel like just giving up and saying, I'm just going with the theological answer to this question that you find in the book of Acts. The Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. So you could just go with that. I couldn't have put that in my doctoral thesis in a secular ancient history department. But I also think I can put my finger on certain distinctives of the early church's mission to a pre-Christian Roman world that seem worthy of our consideration as we ponder how on earth we're going to reach an almost post-Christian America. I have just 4 observations tonight. Each deserves its own lecture. I'm going to throw them out as 4 provocations. And then I'm going to take some questions at the end, which is something I just love to do. First, in the churches of antiquity, evangelists proclaimed the gospel as all Christians promoted the gospel. Now, I've carefully worded that statement because it bumps into the 2 poles of historical scholarship. It may surprise you that at one end of the spectrum, a lot of scholars think there was almost no mission in Christianity. And so the great Yale classicist Ramsay MacMullen famously concluded, from the turn of the 2nd century, the mentions of missionary effort, never abundant, taper off. Christians made no organised official approach to unbelievers. After St. Paul, the church had no mission. Now, that will be surprising to evangelicals to think that anyone in their right mind could come to that conclusion. But it's actually a very widespread conclusion amongst history experts. More recently, the party pooper of scholarship, Bart Ehrman, said something similar. Outside of Paul's work itself, we do not know of any organised Christian missionary work, not just for that century, but for any century prior to the conversion of most of the empire. Interesting. But at the other end of the spectrum, many evangelicals were raised reading the great work of the late, great Michael Green, Evangelism in the Early Church, where he concluded very differently, there was no distinction in the early church between full-time ministers and laymen in this responsibility to spread the gospel by every possible means. So you might think, how can competent scholars come to such radically different conclusions? I think the answer is the evidence is mixed and so hard to interpret. On the one hand, it's true there is very little evidence that all Christians in this early period saw themselves as evangelists in any concrete sense. What we find instead is occasional mentions of prominent and effective public Christians, or evangelists or apologists, as they're often known in America. People like Justin Martyr, Quadratus, Pantaenus, or the hardly known today amazing Armenian woman, Nuni, who single-handedly converted Lazika, the Black Sea country that we now call Georgia. Now, to Ramsay McMullen and to Bart Eamon and to many others, this evidence looks ad hoc, even peripheral. It's certainly not evidence of widespread commitment to mission in early Christianity. On the other hand, there's lots of evidence of less overt missionary activity amongst the rank and file Christians of these early centuries. Things like praying for the work of the gospel, living lives to commend the gospel, preparing to answer questions from critics of the gospel, and so on. In other words, the evidence is twofold in these early centuries. There were some prominent and effective public Christians or evangelists, but the great mass of Christians seem to have played a less overt but no less effective role in promoting the gospel. Importantly, we find this same twofold evidence already in the New Testament. For example, in Colossians 4, the Apostle Paul speaks of his own proclamation of the gospel, and he adds, as you can see there, "as I must." He and his missionary team must proclaim the gospel. But all commentators note he doesn't tell the Colossians to do the same. Instead, Paul urges the believers in Colossae to pray for the proclamation of the gospel, to live wisely before outsiders to commend the gospel, and to be prepared to answer questions graciously. That's it. But notice, Paul says, "as you must do." And all commentators note the double use of the verb "day." It is necessary or must. Paul sees that he and his missionary team had a duty to proclaim the gospel, "as I must proclaim it," he said, but he also thinks that Christians have a duty. It's just not the same duty. Evangelists proclaim the gospel as all Christians promoted the gospel in a range of ways. This is exactly what we find in the copious documents of the first to, say, 4th centuries amongst the Christians. These are the very centuries of dramatic Christian expansion. Now, I've begun a comprehensive survey of all of the things said about mission in all of the Christian texts written in Latin and Greek, between 100 and 400. And I'm collating them all, and hopefully I'll publish it, but I am already finding 3 things consistently. 1, numerous references to specific preachers and public defenders of the gospel. 2, no explicit exhortations for Christians in general to proclaim the gospel. And 3, lots of references to a wide variety of things Christians do to promote the gospel. This last category I find fascinating and multifaceted. There are fun examples of clergy telling wealthy members of the churches not to build baths and bigger homes, but to sponsor evangelists and build churches on their properties. And in one text, this is explicitly called doing the work of the evangelist, even though it doesn't involve the lips at all. There's good evidence that Christians were schooled in how to answer questions from Greeks and Jews who criticized the faith, and I'll give you some detailed evidence of that in a moment. And friends, there are many, many texts urging believers to pray for the work of the gospel and to live a godly life. These seem to be the backbone of mission amongst the rank and file in those first few centuries: prayer and good deeds. Let me read you just one lovely example from the dawn of the 2nd century. This comes from Ignatius, who is the bishop of Antioch in Syria, but he's arrested and taken to Rome, where he is executed, but he's allowed to write letters to churches, and we have those letters, and they are remarkable. And in his letter to the Ephesian church, this is 50 years after the Apostle Paul, he writes this: "Pray continually for the rest of humankind as well, that they may find God. For there is in them hope of repentance, prayer for the work of the gospel. And then he says, therefore, allow them to be discipled by you, at least by your deeds. And the New Testament nerds amongst us can go, ooh, that's the word for make disciple of all nations from the Great Commission in Matthew 28. But look what he says. Make disciples by your deeds. In response to their anger, be gentle. In response to their boasts, be humble. In response to their slander, offer prayers. In response to their errors, be steadfast in the faith. In response to their cruelty, be civilized. Do not be eager to imitate them, but let us show by our forbearance that we are their brothers and sisters. And let us be eager to be imitators of the Lord. I think this has relevance for us today. In our secularizing days, Christian anxiety can lead to two mistakes when it comes to encouraging mission. One is to retreat, and give up the task that Jesus gave us to make disciples of all nations. And I'm guessing in this room aren't many people going for that one. In the scriptures and in all of church history, clearly Christians have a role to advance the gospel. But there's another mistake that is more common, and I think it also comes from anxiety. Sometimes Christian leaders browbeat their congregations, telling them they are all evangelists in a concrete sense. And it sounds pious and it feels godly to say, but the reality is, in the pew, two things happen. One, mission to the world is reduced to proclamation, which is not what the New Testament says. And two, those who aren't very good talkers feel useless for the kingdom. And they become paralyzed with guilt. A guilt the New Testament does not lay on God's people. The liberating fact of the New Testament and church history is that there's a range of activities that promote the gospel. Prayer, godly lives, financial gifts, giving answers to questions. And these are things all Christians can have a go at. If the church of Antiquity teaches us anything, it's that these gospel-promoting activities, in partnership with gospel proclamation, can actually turn an empire upside down. There is a second striking feature of the mission of the ancient church, and I think it too has something to teach us today. Secondly, therefore, the gospel preached to the world closely resembled the content of the written Gospels. In the early church, the gospel preached to the world closely resembled the content of the written gospel. Now, the early church proclaimed salvation through the forgiveness of sins. And so I've often thought early Christians are the closest cousins to modern evangelicals on that question. But the ancient church held out this message of salvation as the theological punchline to the whole narrative of Jesus' life, teaching, healings, trial, death, resurrection, appearances, exaltation, and return. Their gospel was what we find in the Gospels. They learned this, of course, from the New Testament itself. It's Mark who opens his work, which we call a gospel, with the words, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. For Mark, the gospel is the narrative he goes on to tell in written form, all about Jesus' life, healing, teachings, death, and resurrection. It's a point put really well by Robert Gulick, a New Testament scholar, and I believe a graduate of Wheaton. In his commentary on Mark's gospel, he writes, the gospel of Mark 1:1, that passage I just quoted, can hardly be taken as intended merely to name a literary genre, a gospel. Rather, gospel here also refers to the good news as proclaimed, though set forth here in written form. To this extent, Mark's gospel amplifies the outline of Peter's sermon to Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 and indicates the broader scope of the church's preaching than simply the death, resurrection, and parousia, or return, of Jesus Christ. Now, in this passage, Gulick subtly refers to an insight of the great Oxbridge scholar C.H. Dodd in his classic, The Apostolic Preaching and Its Developments. Dodd noticed years ago the profound structural similarities between the preaching of the apostles in the book of Acts and the structure of the Gospels, particularly Mark and Luke. The book of Acts leaves the impression that the gospel preached by the apostles was roughly what we find in the Gospels. It's an insight vindicated in a brand new volume, New Testament people are excited about this one, by Simon Gathercole of Cambridge. The book is The Gospel and the Gospels, Christian Proclamation and Early Jesus Books. Gathercole shows the close correspondence between the earliest apostolic preaching and the content of the first 4 books of the New Testament, the 4 Gospels. And then what he does, and this is the great gift of this book to modern scholarship, he shows how radically different the so-called Gnostic Gospels are to that structure. The Gnostic Gospels have almost no connection with what we know was the earliest apostolic proclamation. Then there's the evidence after the New Testament. In all of our ancient manuscripts of the New Testament Gospels, scribes were careful to add this little title, and it's absolutely uniform in the manuscript tradition. They would always write Gospel according to. What you're seeing here is the end of Luke's Gospel and the beginning of John's Gospel. They'd always write this at the beginning and the end of a Gospel, so you know which one you just finished and which one you're about to start. What does this tell us? It means that the second generation of Christians, the people who received these 4 books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, received them as the written copy of the apostolic preaching. This is the gospel. A striking piece of evidence comes from the late 2nd century, from the greatest theologian of the 2nd century. I'm talking about Irenaeus. Irenaeus was a native of Smyrna in Asia Minor, but he ended up going all the way over to Lyon, to Roman Gaul, where Asterix is set, if you want to sort of picture that. And he was the bishop there and wrote remarkable works. But let me read you what he says, explaining the gospel. We received the knowledge of the economy of our salvation through no others than those through whom the gospel has come down to us. This gospel the apostles first preached orally, but later by God's will they handed it on to us in scriptures, so it would be the foundation and pillar of our faith. They went forth to the ends of the earth, bringing us the good news. They collectively, and each of them individually, equally possessed the gospel of God. Matthew, accordingly, produced a writing of the gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, whereas Peter and Paul evangelized at Rome and founded the church there. But after their departure, Mark, Peter's disciple and translator, handed down to us in writing what was preached by Peter. Luke, too, Paul's follower, set down in a book the gospel that was preached by Paul. Later, John, likewise, the Lord's disciple, who had also rested on his breast, issued the gospel while living at Ephesus. The gospel is what's in the Gospels. Then there's the influential 4th century chronicler Eusebius, who describes the role of evangelists in the ancient church as 2 things. Here it is. They performed the office of evangelists, being filled with the desire to preach Christ to those who had not yet heard the word of faith and to deliver to them the divine written Gospels. My point is, for the early church, the gospel is what's in the Gospels. Now, to be clear, this is not a different gospel from the evangelical gospel of salvation through the forgiveness of sins. It's just that for the early church, the doctrines of grace could not be separated from the narrative of Jesus' life, teaching, healings, death, and resurrection that gave those doctrines their proper context and meaning. And one outcome of this way of thinking about the gospel, as closely corresponding to what's in the Gospels, is that ancient Christians didn't suffer from a modern evangelical malady that loads of people have been talking about. The bifurcation of evangelism and discipleship. Lots of people are writing about this. That's when we preach a gospel that says, come to Jesus and you'll be freely forgiven. And then sometime down the track, and it kind of depends, we tell them that there's also some fine print about what it means to follow this Jesus that you already believed in. That raises real problems. By contrast, the gospel of the early church contained the whole narrative of Jesus' life, teaching, healings, death, resurrection, appearances, and exaltation. What did that mean? That meant that trusting Jesus for salvation simultaneously involved trusting the Savior who died for our sins and the teacher who taught us to love our enemies, shun sexual immorality, and so on. As would-be converts learned the gospel in the ancient world, they were already dipping their toes in the ocean of discipleship. And this leads inevitably to a third striking feature of the church's mission to a pre-Christian world. And you'll never guess, I think it has some implications for us today. Thirdly then, evangelization took place through a surprisingly long program of education. Evangelization took place through a surprisingly long program of education. In two essays 50 years ago, the celebrated Roman historian Edwin Judge, who's still alive and writing incredible stuff that's still coming out to this day. But in these two essays 50 years ago, he alerted New Testament scholars, or tried to anyway. Classicists are always trying to say, hey, New Testament scholars, we do something similar. He tried to alert New Testament scholars to the evidence we have that ancient people looking on at a church in the 1st and 2nd centuries thought they were looking at a school, not a shrine or a religious cult. Here's Judge's words. The Christian faith, as Paul expounds it, belongs with the doctrines of the philosophical schools, rather than with the esoteric rituals of the mystery religions. The religious activities of the Christian societies, the organization and conduct of the cult, are only of minor concern. The view that must have commonly been taken by outsiders looking on is that of a school of disciples under the instruction of a rabbi, or a devout sect committed to the study and preservation of the law, or finally of a society formed to attend upon the teaching of a traveling preacher. In a recent volume, a New Testament scholar, Claire Smith, tested Judge's historical claim with a detailed linguistic analysis of the teaching, learning, education terminology, both in Paul's earliest letters, like 1 Corinthians, and his latest letters, like the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy in particular. Guess what she found? From the beginning, churches could be described as scholastic communities. That's for the 1st century. The description only gets more applicable as time goes on. Many of you will know that the church soon developed a program of catechesis, formal instruction for those inquiring about the faith. So that by the year 200 in Rome, we know that pagans who wanted to know about the Christian faith were invited to an hour's lesson every week before church for 3 years. That's at least 144 hours of lessons prior to baptism. Now, that's roughly two 4-credit courses here at Wheaton. That's just so that the would-be convert can get to the point where they know enough to be baptized. I often feel ancient Christian converts were much bigger nerds than modern evangelical converts. Not then Wheaton students, but then generally evangelical converts. Okay, in Jerusalem, by the 300s AD, there was a fast track. If you didn't want to wait 3 years and do 144 hours, I've got the deal for you. You just have to do 3 hours a day, 6 days a week for the 7 weeks leading up to Easter, and you'll be fine. Then we'll baptize you on Easter Day. That's 126 hours. 144 over 3 years, or 126 in a couple of months. In this case, we know something of the content of the program because we have about 20 surviving catechetical lectures from the great Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem, and they are amazing. The scope of the lessons that people who are just wanting to know about the faith is incredible. The doctrines of God and creation, the law and the prophets, the New Testament with a focus on the Gospels, various moral topics, and then the final week was committed to a detailed Christology from the Creed. Originally the Jerusalem Creed and eventually the Nicene Creed. But here is Cyril explaining to students one of the purposes of catechesis. Be faithful in your attendance of the catechizing. Even though we protract our discourse, do not let your mind yield to distraction. Just hover on that for a little while. Look what he says. You are taking up arms against heresies, against the Jews, against the Samaritans, against the Gentiles. Your enemies are many. Take plenty of ammunition. You have targets in plenty. You must learn how to shoot down the Greek and do battle with the heretic Jew and the Samaritan. This is the evidence I mentioned earlier that Christians were schooled in how to give answers to difficult questions about the faith. And if we had time, which we don't, I'd quote some examples of this kind of catechetical teaching, like the amazing long digression Cyril offers on how to defend the virgin birth against Jewish and Greek objections. It's a remarkable lecture. Now, you might think these ancient Christians were making things overly complicated, difficult for would-be converts. This is not a seeker service. But they might reply that two factors made their approach absolutely necessary in the ancient world. And I might add, these two factors are becoming more and more relevant in a post-Christian world as well. The factors are these. One, there was a profound lack of knowledge of the biblical worldview in Greece and Rome. It required a lot of learning and unlearning for a would-be convert to get their head around what they were getting their lives into. Two, there was quite a lot of pressure on Christians from Roman society to give up the faith. Sometimes that pressure became full-time persecution, sporadic but full-blown. And church leaders felt that only converts with deep roots would flourish. So you'll be happy to know I am not proposing we introduce 126 hours of classes for people inquiring about the Christian faith today, but I am happy to report that I am in discussions with David Kinnaman, the head of Barna Research. He's very excited about this stuff, and he wants to conduct a scoping study of what might be called the catechetical gaps amongst American converts. And then he wants to research what might be the best contemporary educational tools online in an app to redress the catechetical gaps in converts in America. He's excited, so watch this space. My mention of persecution brings us to my final theme, and I'll be brief. 4. Because they, the Christians, knew they had won, they entered the fray with confidence and accepted defeat with grace. There is a paradox in the mindset of the early Christians that everyone who reads early church history spots. Christians were narrow-minded and broad-hearted. They were assertive and humble. On the one hand, Christians in this period cheerfully critiqued the sacred cows of Greek and Roman society. The big sacred cows, like idol worship, sexual decadence, the opulence of the rich, and so on. These critiques are everywhere in early Christian literature. There was no, I hope I'm using this American expression correctly, hiding the ball on controversial topics. Is that correct? Is that how you use the hide the ball? Okay, I think I didn't, but anyway. They didn't hide their disagreements with culture, is what I'm saying. On the other hand, Christians also just as cheerfully accepted mockery and persecution for their views, and frequently told their persecutors, "We love you." There was a strange submissiveness right alongside the assertiveness of the early Christians. I'm going to give you some examples in a moment. First, I want to deal with a powerful criticism of this ancient Christian mindset. It comes from the great 19th century German atheist, Friedrich Nietzsche. People forget that he was a classicist as well as a philosopher. And Nietzsche famously described the early Christian mindset of submissiveness as a slave morality. It's the ethic of the downtrodden, the underdog, the loser. He called what the Christians were doing a radical transvaluation of values, where power, nobility, and wealth are viewed with suspicion, and the humble poor are celebrated. What he was saying was, if you kick a dog often enough, it'll develop an entirely submissive outlook. And he said, that is the disease Christianity gave the world. It's compelling. Except for that pesky thing we call historical evidence. It psychologically makes sense, but our ancient sources, I'm afraid, point in the opposite direction. Christians walked and talked like they were the winners, not the losers. The wellspring of their ethic of non-retaliation and humility was a victor's mentality, not a slave morality. Take the open letter of the early 3rd century rhetorician and public Christian Tertullian. He writes to the Roman governor Scapula, who was brutal toward Christians in Carthage, Tertullian's home. Here's just a brief paragraph from the opening paragraphs of the letter. "We are neither dismayed nor greatly disturbed at the persecutions which we suffer from ignorant men, since we joined this way of life with the understanding that we pledged ourselves to enter into the present conflicts at the risk even of our own lives. For we are commanded by the teaching of our religion to love even our enemies and to pray for those who persecute us. We then are saddened by your ignorance. We have compassion on human error. We worship one God whom you all know, since nature is your teacher, at whose lightning and thunder you tremble, at whose benefits you rejoice. The rest of the deities you yourselves think to be gods, but we know to be demons." There are two clear postures here. There's some confidence going on, yes? Christians are right, the empire is wrong. But there's a cheerful resolve humbly to love even persecutors and to put up with abuse without lashing out. Or take one of my favorite ancient Christians, Lactantius of Nicomedia. He was professor of rhetoric in the pagan school of Nicomedia as a Christian, but he was still teaching rhetoric there. Until the Great Persecution in 303, when all Christian academics lost their jobs. And Lactantius saw the writing on the wall and he fled. Many of his friends were killed. But during his exile, Lactantius wrote a full-scale defense of Christianity for his pagan intellectual colleagues. The whole thing is 120,000 words long, but it is marked by this supreme confidence and a willingness to lose well. Here's just a taste. Do they try to compel us by talk or by offering any kind of argument? Not at all. They use violence and torture. But worship cannot be forced. It is something to be achieved by talk rather than blows. If their reasoning is sound, let them argue it. If they have any confidence in their truth, let them teach it to us. Let them engage in debate of some such sort with us. Religion must be defended not by killing, but by dying. Not by violence, but by endurance. Lactantius epitomizes an attitude we find everywhere in early Christian literature. And I humbly submit it's an attitude we could learn from in our increasingly anxious post-Christian environment. It's a victor's mentality that allowed them to lose well. They reasoned that Christ had been executed by Rome, but Christ had been raised to glory by God. And they are the death and resurrection people, so that's their story. Victory is assured. Death and resurrection. And knowing they had already won meant there was no need either to lash out or to retreat, which are the two problems that arise with anxiety. Lashing out or retreating. Because weirdly, the bully and the coward are often just two sides of the same coin. They can both arise from anxiety. But because they knew Christ had won, they entered the fray with confidence and accepted defeat with grace. Their role was simple. Not to fight, not to dominate, not even to legislate, but to persuade, to pray, to serve, and to suffer. And they had the audacity to believe that's all they needed to win the pre-Christian Roman world to Christ. And within a century of Lactantius, they were proved right. And I simply close by saying, may the same be true in our day. Please, Lord. Thank you.